Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt has reportedly vetoed an inquiry into medical treatments for children who believe they are transgender, but he's not saying why. More than 200 doctors petitioned the government to examine current medical treatments for children who believe they are born in the wrong body, following a significant rise in the amount of referrals to gendered clinics for patients under the age of 17. The Australian newspaper's Bernard Lane has been following this story, reporting that Greg Hunt has said he would neither confirm nor deny he opposed an inquiry because more media and public attention might harm vulnerable transgender youth. Bernard Lane joins me now from Sydney. Bernard, you have been following this issue of gender treatment for teenagers and young people in Australia and around the world for some time. There's a growing body of evidence and certainly action now by governments overseas to have a closer look at what the arrangements are for people under the age of 18. It looked like similar concerns were held by doctors and other medical experts in Australia because there seems to be loose guidelines operating state by state, and it would appear that the federal government shared the concerns of other governments overseas, but maybe not.
I think it's just unclear, Peter. The minister's position is difficult to follow. I sought to clarify it with his office, but the result, it seems to me, is still confused and contradictory. What happened is that the minister gave a statement to the Age newspaper 10 days ago saying he had ruled out a national inquiry because it might cause harm to vulnerable trans kids. When I went to check that statement with the minister's office, he confirmed that he had indeed ruled out a national inquiry, but he wouldn't confirm that harm to transgender kids was the reason. And his office didn't give any other reason. And to further confuse things, his office is saying that the minister's decision to rule out a government-initiated inquiry is no obstacle to a Senate inquiry. So I don't really know where we've ended up.
So let's go back and lay some foundation points here for people to understand, I guess, the depth and breadth of this issue. In Australia, this transgender law changes, significant surgery changes, all of them operate at a state-by-state level. Probably the largest and most notable clinic is at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, and that has seen, since Dr. Michelle Telfer has operated there, and it's 2012, I think, when she took over, 1,776% increase in referrals of young people to that clinic. Now, some are saying that just is more people talking about it. Others are saying, there's some driver there, particularly with young people, and that if they go down the path of significant surgery changes, and beta blockers, particularly for young girls, will affect their fertility. If these interventions happen when they're young and perhaps they change their mind later, they can't go backwards in many circumstances. Where is this at in terms of, are there settled guidelines yet?
Well, this again is not very clear. What happened is that clinic you mentioned, Dr. Telfer's clinic, issued some guidelines in 2018, and those guidelines were badged Australian Standards of Care. And they have been promoted by the clinic and by the Victorian government as a national benchmark and as internationally the most progressive guidelines. But the reporting in the Australian that I've done has raised questions about the status of those guidelines, about the way in which they deal with the evidence, about whether or not they are cautious enough. And one of the issues that an inquiry would probably look at is that document. Following on from the Minister, Greg Hunt, asking the College of Physicians to look at these treatments of under 18 patients in the gender clinics, there's talk of something called a national framework to get consistency of standards across the country, but it's not really clear what that means, how that would be different from the Telfer clinic standards. So again, we're in a situation where there's a lack of clarity.
We're seeing more and more, Bernard, and I've had professors from the United Kingdom on this program. I've had AMA representatives and other doctors out of Queensland, because there is a separate parliamentary inquiry going on there into broader gender law changes to mirror what had happened only a year or so ago in Victoria. I've had particular people involved in a very large clinic in the United Kingdom on this program who say they have left the clinic with regret. They feel that young people have gone down the path of irreversible changes at a time when their mind and emotional abilities are not necessarily settled, and they've had enormous regret because they can't reverse some of the changes. I'm talking about mastectomies for women and other things that have happened when they're young. They are now going down a different path, I'm told, in the United Kingdom. Some of the ministers now are opposing irreversible changes being allowed to occur to young people. Am I right there in saying that? And has this got any influence, do you think, on Australian policymakers?
That is right, Peter, and I think it's internationally significant what's happening in the UK. So if you go back a few years when Theresa May was Prime Minister, she foreshadowed the introduction of so-called self-identified transgender status, meaning that there would be a streamlining so that people could change their gender or their sex under the law with very few requirements. I think the situation at the moment is that you have to wait for a couple of years, and there is some vetting and safeguarding involved. And this was seen as pathologising by the more radicalised trans lobby, and Theresa May initiated a process of review, and it seemed to be expected that self-identified trans status, which we have, for example, in Victoria, would come in the UK. But what ensued was 2 or 3 years of very vigorous debate about this. And last Thursday, the Conservative government in the UK came out and flagged a change to the legislation. And there are 3 key principles. One is respect for the liberty and protection of the rights of transgender adults. A second is protection of the interests and rights of women and girls and of single-sex spaces such as toilets or women's prisons. And the third is protection of trans-identifying minors under 18s who might be wanting to carry out irreversible changes to their bodies through these transgender medical treatments, changes which they might regret. And particularly in the UK, we've seen a growing stream of young adults, mostly young women, many of them lesbians, who say that they bitterly regret going through the gender clinic process, that they felt that in retrospect their real problems, whether it be suppressed same-sex attraction or mental health problems, eating disorders, bullying, anxiety, depression, that those problems were not properly looked at, that there was a fixation with gender, that they were waved through without proper safeguarding, that the risks involved for women, for young women, for example, in taking testosterone, that those risks were played down. And that group of people, the detransitioners, are just starting to get some media coverage in the UK. There's been virtually no coverage of this phenomenon in Australia. It may be that there are fewer detransitioners in Australia. We don't really know.
We'll stay right across this, Bernard. I know you, as I said, have written about it for some time. It's a polarising debate. Unfortunately, trying to have a sober conversation, a factual conversation as we have, ends up getting some of the activists even angrier.